Hi, I'm Coffbeanieart. If you're seeing this, you might be here from my Instagram, Tumblr, or TikTok. If that's you, then thank you for watching. If you're just here from YouTube, then you should check out my other socials. First off, before anything, I want to say sorry for the late upload. This was supposed to go out last week, but I was just really struggling with the script and recording was taking a bit longer than I expected. I guess I had a bit of writer's block, and since I really care about these characters, I didn't want to put something out that was half-baked, so I gave myself another week to make sure I really did like it and was satisfied, so hopefully it was worth it. So this video marks the first in a series I'm starting where I plan to talk about this creepypasta AU I'm making. It was actually this series, along with many others I have for other fandoms, that inspired me to make a YouTube channel in the first place, since I like to talk and thought it would be the best format to share my stories. But anyways, like I said, this is about a creepypasta AU I have that I've called the Mansion AU. It is meant to be an origin story for the Slender Mansion, a trope you're probably familiar with if you've been in the fandom for a bit. It basically explains how all the popular characters we know and love were recruited and became involved in the mansion, how they became buddies, includes some Slenderverse stuff, I guess if you squint. It is also meant to explore how these characters in the mansion affect the world, or more just like the US basically, as a whole. If you're here from my Instagram, you might remember how I posted the first chapter of this AU in comic format. Didn't turn out so great, it took me way too long, which is why I'm now explaining how the series would have gone in video format. To start off the series, I thought it best to introduce the main characters of the story, Masky and Hoodie. But not those guys, no. The other ones. If you're a creepypasta fan who's been around for a while, you may know who I'm talking about. Now, I know that I already stated this in the thumbnail, but just to preface again before going into the speed paints, this story does involve the FANON Masky and Hoodie characters, and I know some people really don't like them, but I want it to be known that I mean no harm in including these characters. This is all in good fun. I've repurposed them, basically made them into my own OCs, and I've grown so attached to them. They're silly and they're doomed by the narrative, and I love them. So this video, I'm just going to talk about them, the backstory I made up for them, how they met, and how everything falls apart for them. Yippee! So this is Tim Sullivan. Both Tim and Brian kept the names of the Marble Hornets characters because I think it's silly, and they're also meant to have the same initials as the actors because I remember in fanfics I used to read writers would confuse the names of the characters and actors, so the fics would have Tim Sutton or Brian Haight as the Masky and Hoodie characters. So their last names, or the characters I made, their last names having the same first letters of the actors' last names is supposed to be a callback to that. Now for Tim's design, you know the drill. Tall, skinny, blue eyes, too iconic to be messed with, I fear. Also an obnoxiously bright orange jacket, and it's not in the speed paint, you'll see it later in the video, but he still has the white mask with the features drawn on in black marker probably, and his mask has a smile on it. He is so happy to see you. He puts on the mask and he is so excited. He's so happy to see you. Common traits that would pop up between fics would be the fact that Tim is the leader of the proxies and extremely loyal to the Slenderman, so I tried to give him traits that would make him fit to lead, while also a backstory that would justify his loyalty. Tim grew up pretty neglected by his parents, mainly being watched over by various babysitters while his parents worked. They couldn't really commit to getting him a nanny or something more permanent. I feel like they'd be too proud to admit that they're not there for their son. They say they can both work hard and care for their kid while only doing one of those things. He learned how to be independent pretty quickly and was allowed to live a more than comfortable lifestyle, though it was at the expense of his parents being workaholics who would take on extra hours at the office or always have work at home to keep them busy. He always felt pretty detached from them. When he was little, he tried to get their attention by doing well in school. He thought that if he showed his parents how smart he could be, they'd pay more attention to him. It didn't quite work well. Their son doing good in school, it was kind of expected by his parents, but not really something that impressed them. But it did impress his teachers. Whatever praise he didn't get from his parents was made up for by how his teachers would tell him that he's such an amazing student, he's so well behaved, and he works hard, he does well on tests, he's going to do great. He would let this praise get to his head a bit. He became a tad bit smug, which made the other kids in this class kind of annoyed by him. They'd pick on him for being a teacher's pet, so when it came to friends, he was pretty lonely in that aspect too. Also, note that most of what I said happens from kindergarten probably to 5th grade, so he's not a major genius, but he's getting it in his head that he's basically set up for greatness. When whatever work you did in 3rd grade was probably hard at the time, but with hindsight you know that the level of difficulty is just going to get worse, and just because you're really smart then doesn't mean that you're going to stay at that level forever. But while all that is going on, he is also maintaining a friendship with our favorite tall man. Tim first met the Slenderman when he was 5. He was out with his babysitter. They were out at this park/playground, and they weren't paying the best of attention to him, so he ended up running into the nearby forest preserve when he thought he saw someone inside. Now he saw that he didn't have a face, but that didn't exactly scare Tim, it instead made him curious. He wanted to learn more about him, and he tried talking to him until he heard his babysitter yelling out his name. He didn't want to get into trouble, so he ran out and tried to make it look like he was just hiding somewhere on the playset. But even as he was taken home, he couldn't forget the man he met in the woods. Whenever he could, he'd ask whoever was watching him if they could go to the park just so he could try to run off into the woods. He was also able to easily convince his parents that he didn't need babysitters anymore, so with all the free time he now had by himself, he spent most of his time in the woods, looking for the Slenderman. Over time, the Slenderman became easier and easier to find, to the point where it felt like he was waiting for Tim. Through this, he grew closer and closer to the Slenderman, or at least that's what he thought. He began to view him as a friend. He would visit him every day after finishing his schoolwork, tell him about his day as they would just walk through the woods together. The Slenderman never hurt him physically, and Tim didn't notice any effects the Slenderman could have been having on him mentally, so he felt safe with him. He viewed the Slenderman as the only paternal figure he had, and he believed that he truly cared for him, that he listened to him, gave him company, and comforted him, and gave him that unrequited love that no one else would. He would have been fine with his life just like that. His parents out of the way, him just going through his day to then spend the rest of the time he had with the Slenderman, until his parents told him they were moving. They were being relocated, so Tim would just have the summer, and then by 6th grade, he would be in a new state and at a new school. Tim was heartbroken, feeling like he was being ripped away from the one person who ever really cared about him. Now this is Brian Hall. Design and story-wise, I got a lot more creative liberty with him since there was just less for me to work with. Right now, let's focus on his design. I made him shorter than Tim just because I remember most fics having Masky be taller than Hoodie. Besides that, I made him emo. I gave him the stereotypical emo bangs like every other proxy OC from back then. I actually think his hair would be naturally wavy, but he's got into the habit of straightening it every morning. And I wanted to give him sad eyes just based on the story I wrote for him. I felt it just fit for him to look naturally miserable. Since Tim got orange, Brian got yellow, so he has the bright yellow hoodie. And for his mask, which you'll see later, I interpreted it as an actual mask, like Masky's, not like the baggy shirt mask it was in Marble Hornets. It still has the frown in bright red, and I imagine he used a paint that would make it glow in the dark, since I remember some fan artists interpreting the features of the masks as glowing. Writing-wise, all I had to base his character off of was the fact that he's shy, he has a stutter, and that he's Tim's friend. Since these two specifically are meant to be partners when they're proxies, I also tried to make sure that they could pull off a hypothetical mission, since in fics they're always doing vague missions that weren't really specified, they're just kind of out doing stuff. But since I was interpreting Tim to be like the brains of the group, since I thought that would make him fit to be the leader, Brian should be the more physical of the two, more willing to get his hands dirty for the sake of the mission. So Brian grew up pretty heavily sheltered and monitored due to a few events that happened when he was really little. Whenever it came to playdates and birthdays, parents found out how negatively Brian reacted to teasing or being made fun of. He would hit the other kids, either with just like punches or grabbing random things and hitting other kids over the head until they stopped laughing at him. There were too many instances of kids crying, sometimes bleeding, saying that Brian hurt them, to the point where no one really wanted him near their kids. Now, is this behavior something that should get checked out by like a professional? Maybe, probably, if this seems to be a habit and if it's showing itself in a really little kid. But Brian's parents didn't really want to take their child to a doctor because in such a tight-knit community, they feared that if Brian was diagnosed with anything, it would speak badly on them. They instead hoped Brian would just grow out of this behavior and kept a close eye on him, making sure he didn't show any other concerning behavior and made sure he didn't take in any violent media, as they thought it would just inspire him to become more violent. When it came to his home life, like I said, he was heavily monitored. His parents would make sure someone was in the room with him, and they also eventually took the door off of his room. He just basically had no privacy in his own home. At school, he was pretty lonely since most parents warned their kids to stay away from him, and with word of Brian's behavior reaching the teachers, they paid extra attention to him to make sure he didn't try to hurt anyone and would sometimes actively keep him away from the other kids. Because of this, he never really learned how to socialize, and he has a hard time talking to people. But as he got older, the kids in his class stopped avoiding him and started picking on him. Physically, Brian doesn't look too intimidating, so their parents' past warnings started to seem silly. They would purposefully make fun of him and taunt him whenever the teachers weren't around to try and get a reaction out of him, and Brian never really tried to fight back. He'd just sort of take it no matter how much it frustrated him. He wasn't really witty enough to say anything back, and at this point he struggled to speak without stuttering or stumbling over his words, and he was embarrassed enough by this that he knew that the kids would just make fun of him if they heard him struggling to speak, and he knew he'd just get in more trouble if he fought back physically. All he had to do was seriously hurt someone, and he feared he'd get taken out of school by his parents, and as lonely as school was, it was the only time he had away from his parents, and he didn't want that to be taken away from him. The only time he ever felt truly at peace was when he was with the Slender Man. Brian first saw the Slender Man when he was 7. He was in the car with his parents when they stopped in front of a local forest preserve just at a red light. He was staring outside the window when he saw him. Brian was almost in a trance, just keeping his eyes on him until his parents drove away, but even then he couldn't stop thinking about him. Brian then saw the Slender Man again that night. This was pre his parents getting rid of his door. He saw him outside his window, and when he reached out towards him, Brian was suddenly outside and he was being led to the woods. This was the first time Brian was without his parents, and for that he really appreciated the Slender Man. Sure, he was silent, but it comforted Brian and even encouraged him to try to speak more than he usually did. The Slender Man later led him back home before sunrise, and this started a routine between them. Though Brian became extremely sleep-deprived, the Slender Man would get him from his home, they'd go to the woods, hang out, and then he'd return home. But eventually, this wasn't enough, and Brian wanted to spend more time with the Slender Man. He would try running away from home or ditching school in order to run off into the woods, which only made things worse for him. This led to him losing his door. His parents were like a step away from giving him one of those kitty leashes, and they told the teachers that someone needed to keep an eye on him at all times. The adults around him just became more cautious, and the few privileges he did have were immediately taken away. Now, this is the part where I talk about how they met, and this might be a good time to mention just because I'm not sure how else to say it, but this story takes place in the Midwest. I don't really have a specific place in mind, just this all is taking place in a fictional Midwestern town, and this story takes place between however old you're supposed to be when you're in 6th grade up until they're 15. So like I said, they first met in the 6th grade when Tim was officially the new kid. He had only got in like less than a week ago. Now, the two felt sort of drawn to each other. Brian saw a chance to maybe make a friend since Tim wouldn't be aware of his past concerning behavior, though he didn't get his hopes up since he's awkward and still has trouble talking to people. But Tim noticed how distant Brian seemed to be, how he wouldn't talk and how he wasn't involved in the other groups as the kids kept trying to talk to him. Throughout the day, they kept trying to catch glimpses of each other, only to find that the other was already looking at them. They first talked to each other after school. Tim asked Brian if he knew how to get to the library, but Brian struggled to give him directions, so he instead started walking him to the library. This was fine. Their walk was kind of silent, which bothered Brian more than it did Tim, but by the time they were halfway there, Brian got a call from his dad. Brian would usually get picked up every day after school, but he was so excited with getting a chance to hang out with someone his age who didn't have any bad or mean intentions that it completely slipped his mind. He answered the phone but was so nervous and scared that he struggled to explain the situation to his dad, who was a bit late to pick him up that day. To this, Tim took the phone from Brian and explained the situation while trying to take the blame off of Brian, telling Mr. Hall that he was new, he didn't know Brian had to be home right away after school, and that he practically forced Brian to walk him to the library. After a bit, Mr. Hall said that he had to drop some stuff off at home, but after that he'd come by to pick them both up from the library, and he just told Tim to be careful. When they got to the library, they spent most of their time talking about their home lives. After talking to his dad, Tim questioned Brian about his parents, where he opened up about his sheltered life with little privacy and how this frustrated him. While Tim realized how difficult this must be, he saw the plus side of Brian getting to spend a lot of time with his parents, and while they're very controlling, at least he knew his parents cared for him, which made Brian wonder what kind of life Tim has to have to seem kind of jealous of his own home life. Think of them both being like, man, this kid's kind of a freak, thank God I'm the normal one. Even so, they became very intrigued with each other. Brian, who saw how quickly Tim was willing to step up to help him with his dad, and Tim, who still wanted to learn more about Brian and provide him company when no one else seemed willing to. This was kind of enhanced when they learned a little bit about each other's background, with Brian wanting Tim to know that he'd be there for him, and Tim who believed he could help Brian with his parents. They became very close very fast. To the other kids, it was the second day of school, and they were pretty much inseparable, together whenever they could be. At school, Tim was able to convince most of their teachers that he could help Brian with his grades, so they would often be sat next to each other just so they could talk and send each other notes during class. They spent all their free time and time at lunch together, not talking to anyone else. Whenever people tried to pick on Brian, Tim was able to drive them away, insulting them back and usually being mean enough that the kids wouldn't want to mess with Brian if Tim was around. Based on the brief interaction with Brian's dad, and still under the guise of being the sort of tutor, Tim would visit Brian a lot. It started with them hanging out at Brian's house, usually doing work or watching TV with Brian's parents around, but Tim tried to gain their trust, show that he was responsible, and that Brian would be safe with him. This led to them being able to be in a room together without Brian's parents there, or them being able to go to Tim's house without having Mr. or Mrs. Hall there to watch them. That being said, this being responsible act was only something Tim put up around Brian's parents. Whenever it was just them at Tim's house, they would often sneak out, usually to the park, which led to them going to the woods. Tim believed that he left the Slender Man at his old home, and Brian hadn't seen him ever since his parents got stricter due to his sneaking out, but the woods still brought comfort for the both of them, so they spent a lot of time there. They would also play a lot of video games and watch a lot of movies, mainly in the horror genre, since that was Tim's favorite, and it introduced Brian to a lot of media he was sheltered from. They were there for each other when Tim realized he liked baking, and they'd make a mess of the kitchen together, and they were there for each other when Brian decided he wanted to go emo and Tim helped him straighten his hair. They also opened up to each other more on an emotional level. Brian told Tim about how when he was young and how he and his parents were scared that he'd hurt someone, though Tim didn't seem too worried. He'd spent basically all of his time with Brian at this point and he didn't see any of that with him, so he wasn't worried that Brian would hurt him at all. Tim opened up about this friend he had, though he was strange, but he hadn't seen him since he moved. He still believed he was real, but he would sometimes wonder if he just made him up due to how lonely he felt at school and at home. Based on how Tim described him, Brian admitted he knew someone similar, but they brushed it off as coincidence since their descriptions were vague and pretty basic, and chopped it up to two lonely kids coming up with imaginary friends, and they were just misremembering past events, but they don't have to worry about that now since they have each other. At least they had each other until high school. It was the end of summer, the summer before their freshman year, and Tim admitted that he'd be going to a different school. Towards the end of last year, Tim's parents made him take an entrance exam to get into a better high school. He felt so out of it that day. He thought the fact that he was tired was enough to fail him, but he found out before they graduated that he actually got in. He didn't think too much of it. He thought that his parents would forget about it, and he'd eventually end up going to the same school as Brian, but his parents already got him his school uniform, and they were bugging him to take his placement tests. While they were disappointed, they tried to reassure each other that they'd still hang out. They could hang out after school and on the weekends. Brian knew Tim could make new friends at his new school, and Tim told Brian that there would also be kids he hadn't met before in high school, so he could meet new people too, so they'd be fine. They found out very quickly how difficult it was to hang out. This was mainly on Tim's part, as he found himself extremely busy. He wasn't used to the level of work or the amount of work his new school was giving him, so he was falling behind in his classes. Worse, his parents noticed, and they started working from home specifically to make sure he wasn't distracted and that he was getting his work done properly and studying enough to get his grades up. He couldn't leave, and Brian couldn't visit him. He didn't expect his parents to take such notice in him so suddenly. He found himself so busy he wasn't even able to get to know the other kids at this school. On Brian's part, he was still too awkward to talk to any of the new kids. He was used to talking to Tim, he was comfortable with Tim, but he struggled to speak and would stutter a lot more when trying to talk to new people. Without Tim, the kids from middle school started to pick on him again, shoving him down whenever they could or actively mocking and making fun of him during lunch or during class. The frustration he used to feel was back again, but worse, and would only get worse since he was back to either being at school or being at home with just his parents. It all blew up the day Brian got into a fight with his parents. Brian got into a slight altercation at school where he and this boy were just shoving each other, and Brian shoved this boy a bit too hard into one of the walls. Now they both got in trouble, but Brian's parents were focused on him. They worried this behavior was a sign that he was going to get violent again, and Brian was angered by the fact that his parents always assumed the worst, and that was like they were just waiting for him to hurt someone. When his parents weren't looking, he snuck out through his bedroom window. It was around November, kinda chilly outside, but he just needed to get away. He tried calling Tim. They usually only talked on the phone before school. Brian figured it was worth a shot, but Tim wasn't able to pick up, so he just left a voicemail as he vented about what was happening. He kept walking down the block when he came across what seemed to be a party. Brian overheard some kids in his grade saying that there's going to be a party someone's older sibling was holding while their parents were out, and that they're trying to get more freshmen to show up. Brian ended his voicemail by telling Tim where the party was and telling him to please try coming by if he could. Brian hadn't ever been to a party before, but he figured that maybe if he switched up his environment, maybe if people saw him in a new place, maybe he'd have a better time talking to people without being as anxious, and maybe he'd even seem more approachable. Most people were hanging out in the backyard, so he tried to blend in there, though most of the kids there were older than him, but he was able to get into the house and tried to find more kids his age. He was eventually able to find kids from his grade, though he still mainly stayed back, just overhearing a few conversations and waiting for the right time to jump in. This seemed like a good plan until he was noticed by some kids he recognized from grammar school. They pointed him out, and now a few more eyes were on him than he would have liked. Outside of school, they could push him around more than they usually could. They started reminding him that he wasn't so tough and scary than their parents thought he was. They mocked his stutter as Brian tried to leave, walking out the front door, but they just followed him, shoving him around as they did. They bet that he wouldn't even be able to land a hit on them if he tried, and they had no one around to help him now that his boyfriend was gone. At this, Brian turned around and punched one of the boys in the face, hard enough to knock him to the ground. It would have been enough to shut the boys up, but the problem was that Brian didn't stop. He got on top of the boy and kept hitting him over and over again, and at this point the other boys were trying to get him off or yelling for help. Some people in the house had walked out to watch. People were too scared to touch him but kept yelling at him to stop, and Brian didn't stop hitting him until Tim came up to pull him away. Tim saw Brian's call, but he had to wait for his mom to get distracted so he could run off to the bathroom to hear the voicemail he left. He could tell that Brian was in a bad mood and that he was hurt by what his parents thought of him. It wasn't long until his mom, who was watching him at the time, was invested in a work call enough that Tim ran out of the house to go meet him at the house party. He lived a bit away and it took him a while to get there, but by the time he arrived, he was able to see Brian beating this random boy's face in. It wasn't until Tim pulled him away that they could both see what had happened. The boy had stopped moving, his face so beaten he was unrecognizable. Brian had an angry, wild look in his eyes and had pushed him back until he realized it was him, and then he was filled with shame and embarrassment. They looked down at Brian's hands to find them bruised and covered with blood. Some people had started calling the police and yelling at the neighbors for help. Tim pulled Brian away and the two ran off to the nearest forest they could find, and they didn't stop running until Tim felt sick. The realization had hit him and he threw up, as he remembered what the boy's face looked like, and he thought about the consequences Brian would face, what they both might face if they kept running, and if Tim tried helping him hide. If Tim were honest, he would also admit that he was a bit scared of Brian. Brian told Tim that he would never, ever hurt him, and that he wouldn't even think of it, but they just had to keep running. The two barely got up, but things started to get a little fuzzy. It felt like there was static in their brains, and while they felt a little lost, they didn't feel scared. While they didn't say anything to each other, they recognized the static and knew the other did too, and they both blacked out. So that's it. They're my babies, and that's their story. Ooh, Brian did a very, very bad thing, but they ran away, and they're static, and they blacked out. Ooh, I wonder what's gonna happen. Anyways, that's all I got. I hope this was worth the wait. I hope to talk more about their work as proxies and other creepypasta characters in other videos, but right now, this is all. If you're here, you should comment your favorite fanon misconception, whether it comes to creepypasta or any fandom you're in. Really, I'm all ears. If you're still here, you should do all the YouTube things like, share, and subscribe. You should also check out all my other socials because I post stuff there first. Anyways, that will be all. So thank you for watching and bye-bye.